And we are going to take you now live back over to the National Press Club again. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska will be speaking at the forum today at the Press Club, talking about the Law of the Sea Convention. Live coverage here on C-SPAN.
Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention. We are particularly honored to have as our conference keynote speaker today, Senator Lisa Murkowski, the first Alaskan-born senator to serve the state and only the 6th United States senator from Alaska. She is the senior Republican member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee and also serves on the Senate Appropriations Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and the Senate Indian Affairs Committee. She was elected by her fellow Republican senators to serve as the vice chair of the Senate Republican Conference for the 111th Congress. She holds a BA in economics from Georgetown and a law degree from Willamette University. As one who has been to Alaska many times, particularly during the Law of the Sea negotiations, since, as the senator knows, it has approximately half of the entire continental shelf, fisheries and other interests of the United States. I'm an enormous fan of Alaska. You cannot possibly go to Alaska without coming away with a feeling that this is the most beautiful place on planet Earth. And I know from my conversations with people in Alaska that one of the greatest treasures of the state is this senator, Senator Lisa Murkowski, who has done so much for Alaska and for the country. Please join me in welcoming Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, John, for your kind remarks, and it is an honor, a delight to be with all of you. I recognize some friends out there. When I have an opportunity to speak on the issue of the Arctic, I don't know, are y'all called Arctic groupies yet or not? I'm not sure, but it couldn't be a better gathering. It really is my pleasure to be able to address you today at the 34th Annual Center for Oceans Law and Policy Conference. I commend you most certainly for putting together a very, very impressive conference, some great speakers that you have in front of us. Now, as all of us in this particular room are aware, the United States is an Arctic nation because of Alaska. And I appreciate the very kind words you've said about my remarkable state. We're very possessive about what goes on in Alaska as Alaskans, but we do recognize that because of our 49th state, it does put this country in a position that we are recognized as an Arctic nation. And I am very privileged to be the senior senator for America's Arctic state. But really, what does it mean? And I ask this question a lot. What does it really mean to be an Arctic nation? I believe that the federal government is just now waking up to this reality. We're trying to define exactly what the distinction means. In my view, being an Arctic nation means that the United States, by virtue of our land and our waters, has a fundamental interest in the region and certainly a responsibility and an obligation to protect those interests. Now, I speak to you at a time, as we recognize, of great change for the Arctic. The pace of change demands that greater attention be focused on the region. The implications of the dynamic, changing Arctic for the residents and important international security, economic, environmental, and political interests absolutely depend upon it. Now, we've seen the interest in the Arctic growing. The general public is paying attention, the media most certainly, the Arctic and the non-Arctic nations really does continue to grow. And the attention is primarily due to the impacts that we're seeing from climate change, the subsequent loss of seasonal sea ice, the interest in shipping lanes, energy, and natural resources. And until recently, the resources of the Arctic were deemed to be too difficult, too remote, too expensive to develop. But with increasing access and high energy and mineral prices, the Arctic's wealth is now being increasingly discovered, explored, and developed. And this includes conventional oil and natural gas, but also methane hydrates and other less conventional forms. Offshore Alaska, we're estimating 15 billion barrels of oil in a concentrated area of the Chukchi Sea, and then about 8 billion barrels in the Beaufort Sea. We're hopeful that this summer we'll have an opportunity for some exploratory wells to prove up. The USGS tells us that the region has possibly up to 30% of the world's undiscovered gas and 13% of its oil. We also think that it holds huge amounts of other minerals like coal and nickel, copper, tungsten, lead, zinc, gold, silver, diamonds, manganese, chromium, titanium. But I think there's sometimes a natural and perhaps a reflexive tendency to question how in the world it's ever possible to drill and produce. How can it be done in a safe manner in such a harsh and I think oftentimes misunderstood and very distant environment? But it is happening, and the technology and the engineering behind some of the existing and the proposed activities is absolutely fascinating. We already know that Russia is turning its eye to the Arctic and its vast energy reserves. They're building the first offshore oil rig that can withstand temperatures as low as -50 degrees Celsius and heavy pack ice. As their oil production is in decline, they're also reducing taxes and bureaucratic hurdles in order to encourage new oil development in the Arctic. They're also planning for a near wholesale replacement of their icebreaker fleet in order to better operate in the polar region. By the same token, an energy company from England is now readying to seriously explore for oil and natural gas for the first time off of the coast of Greenland. Now, obviously, what is happening currently in the Gulf of Mexico has shown us that there are certainly risks. There will always be risks and impacts associated with producing energy. And we must take every appropriate step to minimize those risks into the future. But we also need to be rational in our response to what we're seeing with the Deepwater Horizon tragedy. We don't know exactly yet what has failed or how many components have failed. And until we do, we should be careful, we should be cautious, we shouldn't, in my opinion, pass reactionary legislation that hasn't been fully thought through. We have to learn, just as we did from the Exxon Valdez in Alaska, we have to learn from the Gulf accident. But right now we're still in the process of understanding, collecting the information, and once we have a full understanding of the cause of the accident, I'm hopeful that it will guide us in our decision-making on drafting new regulations that will improve our safety procedures. Now, the Deepwater Horizon incident may have made us more reticent to drill in the deep offshore, but it did nothing to change or to reduce our need for oil and gas, did nothing to change the value of those resources in what is still a growing global economy. So even as we take steps to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, we're going to need oil and gas for decades to come. And I believe that we'll rise from this tragedy not only as Americans, but that the world will learn and grow stronger in terms of understanding the values and the risks of energy production. Now, Alaska's offshore oil and natural gas resources are vital to the nation's strategic economic and energy security, and I remain committed to the responsible exploration and production in the Beaufort and the Chukchi Seas. Since the Deepwater Horizon tragedy has been unfolding, we have been demanding, the administration has been demanding, and have sought to know what those greater protections are that surround these exploratory activities. I think it's important to point out that there are some differences between the Deepwater Gulf activity and up in the Arctic, specifically the relative shallow water depths, the pressures within the area. In addition to that, the shale permits that are in process now have probably had more regulatory, environmental, legal scrutiny than probably any other exploration permit in recent history. Fact of the matter is that all eyes are upon us in Alaska. We need to be given the chance to prove that we can explore safely. Now, the exploration activity in the Arctic, combined again with the declining summer sea ice, has some positive implications for energy security across borders, because LNG and oil tankers will, in some cases, be able to have alternatives to their current, more dangerous, and these clogged routes that go through the Southeast Asian Straits, the Gulf of Aden, of course, the Suez Canal. So non-Arctic nations are going to benefit in this way, but importantly, they can also benefit through the funding element of these huge projects. The exploration, the production, and certainly the construction necessary to develop Arctic resources is going to require all kinds of financing, not just for the sheer scale and remoteness of the projects, but for the levels of the technology needed to bring them online in a way that's safe for the workers, safe for the environment, and as insulated from risk as at all possible. I had the opportunity not too long ago to visit a 4D seismic room down in New Orleans. The images acquired through the 3D are basically animated to give a sense of the shifting oil and the gas reservoirs so that the geologists can study the trends, get a much more telling picture of the resource potential. It's almost surgical compared to the basic exploratory drilling which we've seen over the past century. And it does give a confidence that a well can be targeted and explored with limited impact to surrounding areas. And I think this is just one example of the ways in which technology is able to provide a more reassuring answer to questions about whether or not the world is ready for increased energy development in the Arctic. Another good example of this, and this is more Alaska specific, it's a project that we call the Liberty Project. Some of you may be familiar with this project. It's an extended reach drill rig, which Parker Drilling helped develop for BP to access an oil field directionally 8 miles away. It's not quite there yet, but I'm hoping and I'm betting on good news from Alaska's North Slope on just how far we can continue to reach both literally and figuratively with the directional drilling. And this brings me to a point here. Technology is advancing because oil and natural gas are still the most economically viable energy sources in the world. The term easy oil is being slowly redefined as these technologies develop, and I predict that we will see measured but certain expansion into Arctic lands and waters. And this is significant because the first people of the Arctic have, I certainly believe, a right to benefit from all of their resources, not just their energy resources, but the fisheries, the marine mammals on which they depend for their nutrition, their livelihoods. And I am encouraged by what I am seeing to be an increasing level of engagement rather than opposition from these constituencies. 30 years ago in Alaska, when we were first developing our North Slope fields, we were able to establish production from America's largest single oil field, Prudhoe Bay, by involving the native people in almost every aspect of this new and a very substantial change to their land and to their lifestyle. There was engagement, and oftentimes it was very contentious, very difficult, but there was engagement on multiple levels, on the legislative level, on the administrative level, the operational, and most certainly the personal level. And the ultimate result, I believe, has benefited all Alaskans and our national energy security in ways beyond anything that we could have predicted at the time. I'm betting on good news from Alaska's North Slope on just how far we can continue to reach both literally and figuratively with the directional drilling. And this brings me to a point here. Technology is advancing because oil and natural gas are still the most economically viable energy sources in the world. The term easy oil is being slowly redefined as these technologies develop, and I predict that we will see measured but certain expansion into Arctic lands and waters. And this is significant because the first people of the Arctic have, I certainly believe, a right to benefit from all of their resources, not just their energy resources, but the fisheries, the marine mammals on which they depend for their nutrition, their livelihoods. And I am encouraged by what I am seeing to be an increasing level of engagement rather than opposition from these constituencies. 30 years ago in Alaska, when we were first developing our North Slope fields, we were able to establish production from America's largest single oil field, Prudhoe Bay, by involving the native people in almost every aspect of this new and a very substantial change to their land and to their lifestyle. There was engagement, and oftentimes it was very contentious, very difficult, but there was engagement on multiple levels, on the legislative level, on the administrative level, the operational, and most certainly the personal level. And the ultimate result, I believe, has benefited all Alaskans and our national energy security in ways beyond anything that we could have predicted at the time. Now, it's not just Arctic energy that is drawing increased activity into the region. The impacts of an ice-diminished Arctic are already affecting marine shipping. We recently saw 2 German vessels complete a commercial transit from Asia to Europe through the Arctic Ocean north of Russia. 2 multipurpose heavy lift carriers transited through the Northeast Passage, or the Northern Sea Route, during August and September of last year. The route is now open for a short time in late summer, but it cuts off about 4,000 nautical miles from the 11,000-mile-long traditional journey through the Suez Canal and the Gulf of Aden. We now have reports that a Russian shipping firm has announced that it will use one of its ice-strengthened Arctic tankers to carry oil from the Kara Sea across the Northern Sea route to Japan this year. This would be proof of the concept that could also apply to LNG tankers based on the same dual-acting icebreaker tanker design that we use for the oil tankers. Now, while the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment predicts that it will still be decades before these routes are open for many months of the year, I think we have to consider that this is only the beginning, and if it proves economical, it will happen. We know that there are national security and sovereign interests for all the Arctic coastal states in the region. The U.S. Navy has a new roadmap for the Arctic, and they're studying the feasibility of a deep-water port in the far north. And in support of their efforts, I have introduced legislation that directs the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security to study the feasibility, the location, and the resource needs for an Arctic deepwater port. I think we will find from this study whether it is in the strategic interests of this country, as I believe it is, whether to build a port and where it might be located. A deepwater port would not only serve our military and our Coast Guard needs, but as we develop our offshore oil and gas reserves and see more shipping, more tourism, more vessel traffic in the Arctic, a deepwater port could provide valuable support for these activities as well. The Coast Guard has also embarked on a high-latitude study to determine what assets and infrastructure they may need to be prepared for an ice-diminished Arctic Ocean. With increased maritime activity in the Arctic and truly a shortage of existing infrastructure, it is vital that we determine what the needs are and actively work to provide those resources to protect the Arctic residents and the environment. I have stated, and I know many of you in the room have heard this, but I think we're at a critical time in the Arctic now. There seems to be a couple paths that we could take here in regards to international relations. One is a path of competition and conflict, and the other is a path of cooperation and diplomacy. And I believe the decision on which path we ultimately take will require dynamic leadership. And one of the first areas that we need that leadership is in the United States and the Senate ratification of the Convention of the Law of the Sea Treaty. I believe it's crucial for the United States to be party to this treaty and be a player in the process rather than an outsider hoping that our interests are going to be protected. Access to the convention would give current and future administrations both enhanced credibility and leverage in calling upon other nations to meet convention responsibilities. Given the support for the treaty by Arctic nations and the drive to develop natural resources, the treaty will also provide the environmental framework to develop these resources while minimizing environmental impacts. The United States is the only Arctic state that is not a party to the Law of the Sea Convention. Having first submitted the treaty to the U.S. Senate for approval back in 1994, we have not acceded to it yet. Both Canada and Denmark joined the treaty, Canada in 2003, Denmark in 2004. Now, there are some who say that they don't see the point in joining the rest of the world in ratifying the treaty. They say the U.S. already enjoys the benefits of the treaty even though we're not a member, and that by not becoming a party to the treaty, we can somehow pick and choose which sections we abide by while not subjecting our actions to international review. I respectfully disagree with this opinion. I believe very strongly that the United States must ratify the treaty. But right now we're at a bit of a stalemate. The White House is looking to the Senate to lead, and the Senate is waiting for stronger support from the administration. In part, perhaps the Senate calendar is to blame. It's anticipated that should the majority leader move the treaty to the Senate floor, it would consume some time. It would probably take a week of floor time. And considering that we have less than about 40 legislative days now before the August recess, it's highly uncertain that such time will be carved out unless it becomes a priority for the administration. But given the President's focus on advancing the START treaty, I see even less of an opportunity to schedule the Law of the Sea treaty this year. And I won't say that it's impossible, but I would say that it is unlikely. But unfortunately, failure to ratify continues to keep the United States at a disadvantage internationally and outside the process without a seat at the table. Until the U.S. accedes to the treaty, it cannot submit its data regarding the extent of its extended continental shelf to the Commission. And without a Commission recommendation regarding this data, the legal foundation for the ECS limits is much less certain than if we were a party to the treaty. And according to the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, if the U.S. were to become a party to the treaty, we could lay claim to an area in the Arctic of about 450,000 square kilometers. This is approximately the size of the state of California that lies just north of the North Slope there. And while the United States has not ratified the treaty, we continue to map our extended continental shelf. We've been working cooperatively with Canada the last 2 summers on extended continental shelf data. We're scheduled to work again this coming summer. The U.S. icebreaker Healy completed the 2nd summer of joint mapping with the Canadian icebreaker, and though each ship, the Healy and the Louis Saint Laurent, each ship has their own equipment in order to accomplish the mission. Combining the efforts together provides better data, and they can certainly cover more area together. Canada is expected to make its submission to the Commission in December of 2013 so as to meet its deadline under the Law of the Sea. And the United States, as I've previously stated, will not be able to submit its claim, not until we ratify the Law of the Sea Convention. I am pleased that ever so slowly, and it does seem painfully slow at times, the United States does seem to be waking up to the fact that we are indeed an Arctic nation with responsibilities and obligations. I'm confident that with growing leadership in the Congress, recognition within the administration and from the Arctic community at large, we can continue to highlight the strategic importance of the Arctic for the United States. With that, I thank you for your attention this afternoon. John, I'm happy to take questions if that's appropriate, but delighted again to be able to be with you, and thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And it really is, no pun intended, a breath of fresh air to hear your views on this issue and your support for this treaty. Could you, the last 2 days, we've talked about issues of national security, we've talked about financial security, we've talked about the very interests that, as a citizen, I have for our country. You're a strong voice as a proponent of ratification of this treaty. What do you feel would be the most persuasive messages to get to Senate so that this treaty can be affirmed?
There are several messages that I think need to be conveyed, and I'm not going to tell you anything new. I will repeat the strength of what we have within this argument. When it comes to being a participant, when we talk about our ability as an Arctic nation to allow for an extension to our area in the Outer Continental Shelf, the only way we can do it is if we are a participant in the Law of the Sea Treaty. When we're talking about environmental issues in the Arctic, we need to recognize that the treaty that will govern the Arctic nations is that of the Law of the Sea. That was set forth back in Ilulissat a couple years ago, that there is no need for an additional treaty. So when we're talking about the additional stepped-up activity in the Arctic, I think it is imperative, and I'm speaking from an Arctic perspective here. I think we recognize from national security issues there are many other reasons that we look to the Law of the Sea Treaty. But from the Arctic perspective, we're talking about environment, when we're talking about safety of maritime activity, when we're talking about development of resources and really being able to define where our borders are, I think it's imperative that this nation step forward, that the Senate step forward with ratification of the Law of the Sea. I have urged many of you to not let back and not let down in your advocacy on this issue. I know it can be somewhat discouraging when you don't see it being considered on the floor. We're obviously dealing with many, many weighty issues right now within the Senate, but I think it's important that members in the Senate realize that this issue does not go away. In fact, it becomes even more imperative as we see an area in the Arctic that is ever expanding and truly evolving at this time. So keep up the advocacy. Anything else out there?
What would be the chances of getting having this brought to the floor in a lame duck session after the November election?
I don't know. I wish I could. I wish I had a crystal ball that was a little less foggy. Anything's possible in a lame duck, but I will tell you it will take, I believe, a real firm commitment from the administration saying this is a priority for us. And at this point in time, as I've said, there's a little bit of a stalemate. The administration is looking to us to lead on it. We're looking to them, and neither one is kind of prepared to take that first step yet. And it's not for lack of commitment in the Senate from the chairman and the ranking member on the Foreign Relations Committee. Chairman Kerry and ranking member Lugar are both very committed, I think, in their efforts on this issue. I don't mean to speak for them, but in my conversations, they have been very strong advocates and agree that it is clearly in our best interest that we advance this. But it really does come down to making it a priority within the administration, and we in the Senate then finding that time, making that time on the Senate calendar for the debate that will ensue. Over in the corner here, this one.
Senator, we really appreciate your eloquence here today and your strong advocacy for the Arctic issues and also for the Law of the Sea Convention. And I work for the Coast Guard. I know Admiral Allen has been really appreciative of all that you've done and continue to do. And I've got a question just in terms of the practicality of dealing with some of the negativity from some concerning the convention. What do you say to someone who writes to you or to your office and say, this is giving away to the United Nations control over 70% of the world's surface, or that the convention is going to permit the United Nations to tax U.S. companies in an unprecedented manner? Obviously, completely false, but still, the beliefs that are held by some. I know that former Governor Palin and the Alaska legislature have supported the convention, as you have, but I know that there must be people in Alaska that say you're giving away the store.
There are those, and they're not just in Alaska, of course. You know that there is a group of folks out there. There's a whole lot of people who have their objections to the convention, ratification of the Convention of the Law of the Sea. What I remind people, though, is that oftentimes as I talk with them, I realize that they are operating off of old information. Old information from back during Reagan days. And so it's important that they fully understand what it is that we will have in front of us. And as you say, you know, the issue of taxation by the UN, we recognize that that is not correct. The myths need to be dispelled, and the old history needs to be updated, which I think is very important. And again, I think we need to remind individuals that have opposition that the Arctic that we are seeing evolve today is different than it was during the Reagan years, for instance. And Commandant Allen has stated many, many times, he says, you know, you want to talk about climate change, we're not going to talk about the science here. I don't know whether it's right or wrong, but I do know that I've got more ocean up there that I'm in charge of. That's a fact. And as we put it in those terms and recognize, again, we are an Arctic nation with obligations, with responsibilities. I think it's important that we convey the full, current, updated facts as it relates to what exactly we're talking about with ratification of the Law of the Sea, and again, dealing with an area that was only dreamed about being explored. The thought that we would have cruise ships steaming through you know, the community of Barrow is something that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime, and we are there now. So much of it is really updating what unfortunately is old information.
Yes, Senator, back to oil exploration. How, if at all, do you think the current fiasco in the Gulf of Mexico would affect the enthusiasm of your constituents for drilling on the North Slope? I used to deal with the Eskimos on the bowhead whaling issue when I was in government. I've been up there a few times. I understand the fragility of the ecosystem and the extent to which those people in your North Slope borough depend upon that fragile ecosystem. So the question is, do you think what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico will have an effect on prospects going forward for drilling on the North Slope?
I do. I do believe that what we're seeing in the Gulf impacts not only drilling activity in the Gulf of Mexico, close in and deep water, but I think it impacts the opportunities for offshore throughout the country. I think it has an impact, will have an impact on development of our energy policy. And I would like to think, and I think I stated very clearly in my remarks, I would like to think that as a consequence of this tragedy that we're seeing unfold in the Gulf, we will learn from what has happened, but we will be thoughtful and considered in how we go forward and do so in a manner that is not reactionary. There's a lot of emotion that is attached to this disaster. 11 lives were lost. The environmental damage that we anticipate is unknown. There is a great deal of uncertainty and anxiety out there, and as an Alaskan who has lived through great tragedy with the oil spill, with the Exxon Valdez, we know it all too well. I do believe, though, that we recognize that with exploration and activity, there will be risk. So how can we work to minimize that risk? Right now, there is a kind of a, I won't say an impulse, because it is more considered than that. I think it was appropriate that the Secretary put on pause, if you will, the permits that were pending for offshore. I am hopeful that the Secretary and the President will look at the differences that you have when you are exploring 5,000 feet below the water's surface versus what we would be doing up in the Arctic. We're looking at in the Chukchi Sea, the area that's being considered by Shell right now, and the permits that they're waiting on, is drilling in an area of about 150 to 200 feet. So the depth of your water, the pressures that we're talking about here are entirely different. When I spoke to Commandant Allen a couple weeks ago, and I compared to the oil spill in the Gulf to the Exxon Valdez, he said, no, Lisa, he said, it's more comparable to Apollo 13. Because for us to be able to access and deal with and try to understand what is going on, we may as well have been on the moon. Where we will be operating, hopefully, in the Chukchi, it's in shallow enough waters that you can send a man down there to deal with, to check out, to inspect. I think it is appropriate to note, though, that after the spill, Shell, in their efforts to gain final approval to proceed up in the Chukchi, went through not only a full-on critical review of the plan that they had proposed, they went beyond. They went beyond what was requested in their permit and have put in place some additional measures that they have identified in light of what they're seeing going on in the Gulf of Mexico. They've got well control enhancements. They have enhancements in the blowout preventers, evaluating the risk benefits of additional shear rams. So you've got greater redundancy, a system called a remote hot stab system. Again, redundancies in all aspects of the prevention components, in terms of having the capability to respond in the event of a disaster, having the remote operating vehicles and the divers there in a backup launch, having a prefabricated coffer dome pre-staged in Alaska. They've looked at what is going on and saying, okay, we're going to be operating in an area that is remote. We're a long way from assets that you see more readily deployable in the Gulf. How can we be prepared? If we were in this situation, what would we do to respond? So they have gone ahead and put in place these measures in anticipation. And as I mentioned in my comments, there is probably not a permit underway for exploration drilling offshore in this nation right now that has met with more rigorous scrutiny over years. BP has been, or excuse me, Shell has been underway with this project and attempting to get the permits for about 3 years now, and have gone through as many courts as you and I would ever want to. The environmental reviews that have preceded it in terms of a level of scrutiny, because I know right now one of the big issues is, was MMS paying as close attention as they should have? Was there not only technological failure, but was there failure on the administrative, on the enforcement end of it? And we need to know for sure that we're not opening the doors for something like that in Alaska. As an Alaskan, as somebody who believes very strongly that we can develop our resources, but who demands that it be done in a way that is balanced and is accountable, we will not accept a level of risk that is not tolerable. So hopefully there will be lessons learned and done so in a positive way. But I do believe that this tragedy that we're seeing in the Gulf will impact our energy policies as we develop forward.
Senator, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For your wonderful leadership for Alaska, for Arctic, and for the Walton Sea. Let me just mention one other point of a very fine Alaskan who was involved in the Walton Sea negotiations. That was a person who had been a congressman for Howard Pollack, who at the time of these negotiations was the deputy head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He was the representative of the Commerce Department on the Interagency Task Force that did all of the work in the background and negotiation of this treaty. So you have also the legacy of an Alaskan, a very fine Alaskan, who did a superb job in the background of this treaty. So thank you very, very much.
Look forward to working with all of you. Thank you, John.